Hello and welcome to the Prisma ORM Query Fundamentals course. My name is Xander. This tutorial is part of a whole course playlist, which you can access for free on YouTube. For deeper learning, the extended course is available for purchase at Udemy. You'll find all the resources and links in the video description. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly promotions, discounts, and Udemy course giveaways. Before we start working with data, interacting with the database, let's just go through some of the basics of setting up our Express application so that we can start to build API endpoints and learn how to interact with the database. Okay, so this is the code base that we finished creating in the last module. So I've gone ahead and downloaded that. That's where I'm going to start. Of course, we're going to need to set up our Docker containers. That's the first step. So just make sure that you've removed any containers that you might have floating around and potentially any volumes that can sometimes be useful. So let's go ahead and create or start our Docker containers. So we're going to use Docker Compose build up. You might not need build if you already have the images, but nevertheless, it's going to ensure everyone then gets to the same point. So that's the containers started. Now, with the containers started, let's remember that what we have already built. When we created initially our Express application, remember we did define an index file in our Docker Compose code. So here we created a new index file. This is it right here. And inside of here, we created a small endpoint to test to ensure that Express.js was working correctly. So open up the browser, type in localhost 3000. There we go. Hello, new course. Right, so that's what we built so far. Right, so let's try and first visualize what it is that we're developing here. Now we have a client which is going to send a request to the API that we are developing. Now here in this course, we're going to use some API documentation to simulate and to test our endpoints so we can send requests to our API. So we send a request to the API to be processed. Okay, and then of course Express.js app that we're building will then capture that request and then process that request. Now typically you might set up in Express routes and controllers. Now here in Express, routes define how your application responds to client requests for specific endpoints. And then we can say that controllers handle the logic associated with these requests. So sometimes we might like to separate these two components to better organize our code in a manner that promotes clarity, scalability. So the client sends the request. Express.js utilizes the routes to determine how to handle that request. And then we can then attach routes to controllers, and controllers will then have all the business logic or the code, which might, for example, connect to the database and manage that data and process that data before then going ahead and then sending it back potentially to the client. Now, some requests, obviously, we don't send in information back because the client might be, for example, inserting into the database. But some requests might require us to return data back to the client if the client was, for example, trying to retrieve data from the database. In this course, to help structure the code through different tutorials, I'm going to place all the code in the root file. That's what you're going to find, and from there we can interact with the database. Right, so everything so far is in this index file. What we're going to do here very simply is add a new folder. We're going to call that routes, and inside of there you're going to find all of the tutorials that we're going to create. So let's create in an example file, example.js. So let's first migrate our endpoint here that we've created to the root example file, and then we connect it all up and have it running like it was before, but that will then show us the structure, or start to show us the structure that we're going to build in this course. What you're going to find is that all of the examples is going to be inside of this root folder, and I will separate the files into separate tutorials as we work through each module. In Express.js, a router serves as a mini application capable of handling middleware and routing functions. The Express router allows us to create modular, mountable route handlers, and this enables a more organized and maintainable code base. So we need to bring in from Express the router, so express.router. Now, this is going to help us define routes and their associated logic separately from the main application file. And this is going to help us promote cleaner and more manageable code. Right, so let's see if we can demystify what this router is providing us. I mentioned the router serves as a mini application. So let's take a look. Right, so the client sends a request to our endpoints or to our API. So inside of this request is a whole bunch of information, one of them being a URI. So this is essentially, it looks like a URL. So it's going to have like slash, let's say slash products, slash, let's go for all. Okay, so this information might be in the request sent by the client. And what the client is trying to access in this case is a list of all the products. Now, what this URI is to our Express application is a specific resource on the server or in our application that can then perform the correct logic in order to respond to this client's request. So the router or the route handler is able to handle this client request and to pass this request to the correct business logic, which is going to perform the actions requested by the client and, in this case, return data back to the client. So what we would need to do here is to create a new route. So for this request, we would need to create a new route, and we would need to specify in that route the fact that this is going to handle this particular route that is being requested by, in this case, the client. So we're going to need to create a route which is going to match whatever the client is requesting. And then we simply build the logic to, for example, interact with the database in this case, and then send that information back to the client. So now we've initiated our router, we simply need to add to that router. So we specify router dot, and then we go ahead and add our endpoint. If we take a look at our previous endpoint, that was capturing requests that are sent to the home location, just slash, so the root location of our server. So let's use that again. So we'll learn more about different types of requests as we work through the course. This is going to be a GET request that we're going to capture. And we know that we want to capture the request if it's sent to the root location, just slash. Now, if we need to capture anything from the client that they've sent to us, we can do that through the REQ, okay, the request information. And if we want to send back any information, well, we're going to need those tools. So we bring in response here so that we can utilize that to send information back to the client. Right, so what we've done here is we've started or created an Express router, and we've now added an endpoint so that clients can send requests to our server. So what we need to do is to make sure that we can export the router and include it in our main index.js file. So let's go ahead and add module.exports equals router. So this is going to make it accessible from other files that require this module. Right, so let's go back into index here. We need to remove this line now because we've now created our route. Right, so from the top, we have the import. So we import Express module using Node.js require function and assign it to the constant Express. So now we've imported Express, we now have the capabilities to create an instance of an Express application, which is then assigned to the constant app. So what you need to try and imagine here is that we've created an Express application in memory now, and we can then go ahead and add different functionality to it. And that's what we're doing here with this app.listen. So we've created this new instance of Express, and now we're using that to add additional information or additional functionality to our application. If you like, you can think of this as a blueprint, creating the blueprint for our application, and then we basically just need to customize it with routes, middleware, and settings to serve our application for specific needs. So based upon that, we need to tell Express that we have created some separate routes so it can find and utilize them within our application. So for that, let's go ahead and import that in. Let's call this index router equals require, and then we just need to specify exactly where that is. So from this file, we need to go into routes, and then inside of there we have example. Now that we've imported the routes, we need to attach them to our app. So app dot, and then this is going to be use, and then we need to specify maybe a starting point, a prefix. So let's just use slash for now, and then bring in the router. There we go. So now we've created a new Express application. We've now connected it to our routes, and we know where to listen for incoming requests to our application. Now we've made changes to the code. Let's go ahead and refresh. Now it looks like it's working, but what you'll see is that let's just make some changes here to what's being outputted. If we go back and refresh now, notice that we're still returning the same result, because what's happening here at the moment, at least, when we change any data within our application, it's not being dynamically updated. So what we would need to do at this point, at least, is just go ahead and restart the containers. Once that's done, take a few seconds. We didn't need to use, the reason why it's taking so long is because we're using the build command, which we don't need to do once it's started. So go ahead and refresh, and now you can see the endpoint is working correctly. Now remember, the slash just refers to the home. That's our URI that we're passing over from the client here to the application, just slash, and that's then providing the endpoint that's associated to that location. We will tackle the issue of our application not reloading whenever we change or add new code a bit later on in this module. But what we have now is a simple setup which we can now start to learn how to interact with the database. So we have now set up the basic workflow that we're going to be using in this course. Within our API documentation, which we haven't set up yet, we're going to be able to send requests to the Express.js endpoint. Our router is going to handle the request and then make sure that the request is handled correctly based upon the URI that's inside of the request. Inside of our routes, we're going to handle the business logic of interacting with the database, and then, of course, if required, send any data back to the client. Right, so now we have the basics set up. Let's move forward into the next tutorials where we start to learn how to actually interact with the database.